Welcome to Building Safer Spaces, Harm Reduction in Action, a three-part webinar series as part of an innovative partnership offering continuing education opportunities to train social workers in the practice of harm reduction. Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Jen Tracy, and I'm the Chief Program Officer at the RIZE Massachusetts Foundation. RIZE is grateful to be part of this groundbreaking partnership with the National Harm Reduction Coalition and the National Association of Social Workers Massachusetts chapter. We're working to expand knowledge and create space for dialogue about harm reduction and social work to advance practice and deepen relationships with clients. We are so excited to welcome you to the final webinar, a little sad, but excited, in a three-part series focused on topics such as trauma, addiction, and supporting survivors of sexual violence in the practice of harm reduction. This series builds on our past webinars on themes such as cultural humility, stigma, and supporting families impacted by substance use disorder. As some of you may be joining us for the first time today, I'm happy to share just some brief background about RIZE. Launched in 2017, RIZE is a public-private partnership solely dedicated to funding and collaborating on solutions to end the overdose crisis. Guided by those with lived and living experience and unafraid of new ideas, RIZE is building networks, creating programming, and investing in community partners who are using novel approaches to preventing overdose and increasing access to treatment and recovery supports. Strategic workforce investments like this ensure that professionals like social workers have the critical tools you need to directly support your clients experiencing substance use disorder. Harm reduction offers a set of practical strategies and ideas aimed at meeting people where they are to reduce the negative consequences associated with drug use. And we know that social workers are uniquely positioned to integrate those practices to improve client well-being. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. As Chris Belli said, this webinar will run from 12 to 2 p.m. with a short 5-minute break in the middle, and it supports two continuing education units. These CEs are also approved for our neighbor attendees from Rhode Island. Please remain on mute throughout the webinar, but do use the chat for questions and comments as we go through the webinar, and we'll get to them as we can. We'll aim to reserve the last 10 minutes or so for Q&A as well. Please make sure your full name is displayed on your Zoom. This presentation will include verbal descriptions of images that you see in the slides to accommodate attendees with visual impairments. And as Chris Belli said, slides will be shared in the chat and after the webinar to those who complete the evaluation form. Also, the webinar will be recorded and later posted on the NASW Social Work Online CE Institute. And if you're attending this program live, you must stay for the full event to receive your credit. The recordings will also be posted on our RIZE YouTube channel for non-credit viewing at any time. So at the end of this webinar, a code will be shared with everyone. Participants must enter this code in the course evaluation form to receive credit. You can find the link to the form in the email reminder that was sent with the Zoom information, and it will be shared in the chat as well. So thank you all in advance for taking the time to share your feedback on those evaluation forms. We take them very seriously, and they're super helpful in our future planning. So for this series, we are once again led by Tanagra Melgarejo Pulido from the National Harm Reduction Coalition and Joe Pereira of Outlook Associates of New England. And with that, I am happy to turn it over to you, Joe and Tanagra. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jen. I'm gonna be sharing my screen. So give me 1 second. Can folks see the slides? Okay, perfect. I just need to do one more thing to get situated here before we go ahead and get started. Bear with me, please. Make sure that out. Super. So buenas tardes, good afternoon, everyone. I am really excited to be here and also a little sad when this time comes around in this um, series of trainings. It's always bittersweet, and I'm always just grateful for the opportunity to be in community with everyone in this space. As just said, my name is Tanagra Melgarejo Pulido, and I'm part of the National Harm Reduction Coalition. And I'm gonna pass the mic to my comrade Joe so he can introduce himself.
Thank you, Tanagra. So my name is Joe Pereira. As mentioned, I actually have a private practice in Arlington, focusing on a number of things, but two areas of interest are working with people around chemical addiction, substance use disorder, and also anger management. And I also do some teaching at the BU Graduate School of Social Work.
Thank you, Joe. And as social workers, we're always really thrilled to be able to have the opportunity to connect with folks and to think about these topics, particularly the topic that we're going to be addressing today, which is how can we work with survivors of both intimate and sexual violence, intimate partner violence and sexual violence from a harm reduction framework, how harm reduction can help us also engage in trauma-informed care and better serve the survivors. And so Joe and I will be leading you through this session. Just a little bit about my organization. NHRC has been around for 30 years. We were established and got together as an organization by people who use drugs in the midst of a pandemic. At the time was the HIV/AIDS pandemic, and people organized because we needed to be involved in conversations that were happening at all different levels in terms of how to best address that pandemic. And so out of that, we continue to do this work. We're continuing to do this work committed to creating spaces that create dialogue, spaces for dialogue and action that can help heal the harms that are caused by racialized drug policies. And we do that through all those different avenues. If you are interested in getting to know us more, I invite you to visit our website. We have a lot of resources and publications and many, many, many different things for folks. So please, if you haven't visited it, I encourage you to do so. And I think this is Jujo.
Actually, Tanaka, I think it's you.
It's me?
Yes,
okay.
the next two are you. Yes, sorry.
Oh, okay. I thought it was
Yeah.
you. Okay, so it'll be me. So as one of the things that is important for us to do, many of you may have been to our previous trainings in this series, and some of you may not. And so in order for us to be able to have this conversation with everyone in a space where we make sure that everyone knows what we're talking about, we'd like to sort of start with introducing some basic harm reduction concepts for folks. So for some of you, it may be a refresher, and for some of you, it may be like an invitation to dive deeper into what this practice is. So harm reduction is both approach, and as we're going to see in a moment, it's also a movement. As an approach, harm reduction gives us the opportunity as social workers to utilize a series of strategies. It gives us the opportunity, multiple strategies. If you know us, you know that Joe and I both love to use food analogies. It's about using, having a smorgasbord, a buffet of options that we can explore with participants, that we can discuss and think through, that can help us understand better how can we support them to reduce the negative consequences that can come or that may be associated with either drug use or sex work or other behaviors that they may consider risky or harmful to them. And we can do that through safer techniques, which means, you know, in harm reduction, when we think of safer techniques, we can think of giving folks access to new sterile equipment, access to, for example, in cases of intimate partner violence, for example, contraceptive care, reproductive sexual care for folks so they can have control of over their bodies if that is something that has been weaponized against them in the context of the relationship, right? Safer techniques may be having access to new sterile equipment, as I said, but also to testing equipment for substances. A safer technique may be teaching someone who depends on their partner for the administration of a substance to teach them how to use that substance and how to administer it for themselves, to themselves, so they don't have to depend on the partner to do so. Right, so it's again a safer technique to give that person control back of that process. Managed use may mean using less, in different, utilizing different routes of administration whether it's smoking, snorting, or injecting. That may look different for the person. It may be thinking about, how can you use multiple substances in a safer way? We know many people engage in polysubstance use, which is the use of more than one substance at a time. That we know that also can heighten the risk of folks. And it's not to say to someone, oh my God, you're horrible for doing that. We know folks are going to do it. So how can we help them to think through and have in place strategies to be able to do it in a safer way, because it can be done safely? And then finally, we have abstinence, which is, again, an important conversation to have with folks that we're working with. What does abstinence look like to you? What does that mean to you? What is your goal for abstinence? Harm reduction believes in abstinence. There's a misconception out there that we are against abstinence. Actually, abstinence is part of the harm reduction spectrum. What we are always against is we're against forcing people, coercing people, and harming people along the way. If it's something that the person is choosing, we definitely want to support that person move towards that process. And also, we know that nothing that is forced ends up well for folks. Many times we're setting them up to fail instead of succeeding. So we really want to explore what is their goal with abstinence and what abstinence looks like for them, because abstinence can look very differently for me than it does to Joe. And you know what? That is okay, because that's what harm reduction is about. It's about giving people room to define what this concept looks like for them, and how can they be sustainable, and how can they be set up to succeed when practicing them. And as I said, harm reduction is also a movement. It is a movement that is rooted in the belief, in this heartfelt belief, that you will not have public health if you don't think about social justice. You cannot have one without the other. Both of them need to go together. That the only way that we will end inequality and oppression is by fostering a framework that is rooted in the health and liberation of the people that we're working with. Many times, the real causes of harm are not the drugs themselves. The real causes of harm are racism, misogyny, trans and homophobia, right? The war on poverty, the war on people, right? Those are the real causes of harm many times that we see impact people very much directly. And we also know that the only way that we can achieve or move towards transformative change is if we center, we listen, we uplift, and we trust the leadership of those that are most impacted. And those are our program participants. Those are the clients that you see. Those are your patients.
So two kind of other principles that I think are important, and again, for those of you who attended our prior workshops, this will sound familiar. And the first one is, the stance that we take with the people that we work with, and the first one is the personal autonomy, and to really appreciate an individual's capacity for self-determination or self-governance, and that they are making the best choices they can with the tools and resources that they have. And so, for all of these principles that we're thinking about, what works is keeping people engaged in treatment, keeping them engaged in services. And so, if we're not respecting their personal autonomy, then they're likely going to drop out of treatment, or they're not likely going to access services. And so then we're not able to do the work. So these are really important principles to kind of keep people engaged.
And I wanted to add, Joe, that in the context of working with folks, particularly folks that are in situations of intimate partner violence, this becomes really, really crucial. Uplifting, centering, and protecting personal autonomy. I worked in this field for many years. And one of the things that I saw was that many times we as providers felt that we knew what was best for people. And that was, sort of a tension between what the participants wanted. And here in Puerto Rico, for example, we would force participants to cut all communication with their the partner that was being considered abusive. And I had participants that used to say to me, I need to be in contact with him, because if I am in contact with him, I know what he's thinking and I can protect myself. When I don't hear from him, where he goes silent, that's when things are really bad for me. Right? So that is not going to work. Not talking to him will put me in further danger. right? Asking for a protective order maybe doesn't make sense for me. So we really have to sort of weigh in and think about what is this person telling me and how can I really respect and center that person's autonomy in this process, to ensure that they are able, as Joe said, to stay engaged with us and also to feel that we trust them because they know better their situation that we know it, right? They're in it.
And then the other principle here is radical neutrality and acceptance. And again, I just want to emphasize that this is not an easy thing to do, right? And so this is where it's really important for us to kind of really continue to monitor ourselves as we're working with people. And to Naga's point, we may be working with somebody who is in a violent relationship. And so to kind of be able to hold that space with them is not easy. And so I think that's important to keep in mind. I would also say, I think what has really helped me with this is, and probably many of you are familiar with it, is motivational interviewing. I just think I wish, as a instructor at BU, I wish it were taught more for 2 years, because it's really a very, very important way to engage individuals and for us to let go of this notion of being the expert. I also just wanted to share this quote from Carl Rogers, who many of you know really kind of was kind of one of the founders of kind of person-centered therapy. And he has this great quote, and I'll probably be sharing one later on. The curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change. And I just really think that that's a great quote as we think about the individuals that we work with.
Thank you, Joe. And so besides those really important sort of principles that Joe mentioned, as you will see, harm reduction also has its own set of principles. The 6 principles are the underpinnings of our practice and our movement. I think, to me, they're very much similar to after, a little bit later on, we're going to look at the healing center engagement principles and the principles of trauma-informed care. And to me, they're very much connected. We always start by centering people's health and dignity. And for us, is letting people define what health is to them. Sometimes we'll have participants that will come to us and we will start thinking that health to them should mean stop substance use. For many of them, that's not it. For many of them, health means being able to get their IDs, right? Or their own personal papers that DPW came, the Department of Public Health came and did a sweep and threw everything out, and they don't have access to that. For them, maybe health means to be able to go to our annual physical. For them, health may mean to be connected again to family, to have a hot meal, to be able to rest. Right. So letting people define what health is really treating people with dignity, right? Letting them drive the process, really trusting them and believing them and really listening to them and really centering and protecting people's personal autonomy, as Joe said, from a place of radical neutrality and acceptance. And then, as you will see, the word participant again repeats itself here as a theme, right? Participant-centered services, participant involvement, and participant autonomy, they're the key principles to this practice, to the practice of trauma-informed care as well. How do we make sure that what we're offering people is resonating with them and is making sense and is really helping them out, is by really engaging the participants in the process of defining and structuring those services and those processes with us. And we need to involve them in that practice. They are the owners of their process. We're here to support them, to accompany them, to listen to them. Sometimes we're there to be the first ones to go in if they need us to go in so we can take the hit, right? Or to open that door. And ultimately, they're the ones who should be driving what this process is for them and what they need to get out of this process. And we need to then trust that person's autonomy, right? And really let them practice it. I've had many participants tell me, you tell me what to do. And I understand that as like them telling me, I'm not sure, I feel insecure, I feel unsafe, I've never had the opportunity to practice choosing what I need to do. I had a participant who had been with her, was married off at 13 years old and had been to a much older man and had been with him for about 30 years. And so when she decided to leave him, she was lost because she had never been able to make a decision for herself. And the first thing she said to me is like, can I cut my hair? And I said, what do you want to do? Because he liked her hair long. She hated it. And I said, what do you want to do? She's like, I don't know. And I said, let's think about this, but we don't have to decide now. And then she came back a couple of weeks later and she said, you know what? I cut it off. I want to cut it all off. This is not me. This is not who I am. Right. And it seems small. And it was a huge step for that person to begin to practice their autonomy. Right. And from that point on, once she made that decision, then we started looking at all the other points where she could start practicing in a safe space, in a safe container, that autonomy, to be able to begin to make those decisions for herself and to build that trust in who she was as a person. And so we need to also understand that all of these issues are not isolated, that there are social cultural factors that ¿cómo se dice eso? That intersect and impact a people's ability to make choices, a people's ability to practice their autonomy, a person's ability to be free and to move with dignity through the world. And so understanding the impact of those social cultural factors individually and how it looks for every person we work with is really important. And in harm reduction, we're pragmatic and realistic. We know that many times the solutions to the issues that are facing folks should be really simple, but this system makes them really complicated. It should not be this difficult for people to have access to quality, dignified healthcare. It should not be really this difficult for folks to have safe housing. It should not be this difficult for folks to be able to have quality and safe food, nourishment. It should not be this difficult for us to live freely and move through this world without feeling that our identities are a threat to others. And yet we know that this is the reality that we're in, and we fight to change that. And as we fight to change that, we also acknowledge to folks that and say to them, I know that what you need is housing. You've told me that, and I know that it's really challenging in this context to find housing. And so what are the things that we can do together in the meantime to keep you safe and keep you well, right? It's that pragmatism and realism that is so important, because otherwise our participants will feel that they're being gaslit every single day by the systems that are here to oppress them. And sadly, we work within those systems. And so we also bear the brunt of what those systems do to folks, as we bear the brunt of what they do to us as providers that are creating spaces to hold people's pain, people's trauma, and also people's joy, and also people's growth. And so we're going to explore now and move into what is trauma, right? What is trauma and how it looks for the people that we work with. I invite folks, as we are going through this conversation, if you want to add in the chat from your perspective, from what you've witnessed, what is trauma in terms of the work that you do with your participants, you feel free to do so. For the purpose of this session, we are looking at trauma not only as an individual experience, we're looking at trauma also as a collective experience, as I was saying earlier, and we're looking at trauma as an interpersonal experience for folks as well, right? We know that there is historic and structural trauma, and we're going to look at what that is in a second. And that can look like as community violence, it can look as sexual harassment, it can look like medical trauma. For many of our participants that are survivors of intimate partner violence who also have used substances, the medical trauma and the medical violence that they have experienced is pretty high up in there. It can look like microaggressions, right? It can be like, oh, you're so smart, I don't know why you're doing such dumb things, right? It's like a little microaggression. It's those little comments that we say to people that really, they're not little at all, because they really trigger trauma, and also they hurt and harm folks. It can look like sexism, it can look like racism, it can look like sexual violence, it can look like human trafficking. All of these are experiences that create harmful outcomes for people, and that have to do and are rooted in also creating trauma for folks. And so one of the definitions of trauma that I really appreciate is this definition of trauma that SAMHSA came up with. SAMHSA developed this in 2014, and I still feel is really current and relevant today for us in the work that we do. And so SAMHSA tells us that there are 3 E's of trauma. There's the events, is how we experience those events, and then the effects of those events can be short-term and long-term effects that folks experience. And for the purpose of this session, I want to share this definition with you. Individual trauma results from an event It can be a series of events or a set of circumstances that are experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful. They can also be experienced as life-threatening, and they all have lasting adverse effects on that person's well-being, whether it's functioning, mental and physical, social-emotional, or spiritual, right? And so we're looking here, it can be an event, it can be multiple events, it can be a series of circumstances. It's how the person experiences that, right? And how they understand the effects of those experiences impacting their day-to-day life. And so as we're moving through the session, thinking about our sort of participants, patients, or clients that are survivors of intimate partner violence, right? How can those events, those circumstances, or a series of events impact them, right, in the short and long term? How is that trauma present in their life, and how they may be coping with it, right? How they may be coping with all these different kinds of trauma that can come out from that particular event or series of events. And as you probably know, there's many examples of trauma, but some of the ones that we wanted to uplift, particularly because they're related to the communities that we have worked with, are experiencing or observing physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. So when we think of intimate partner violence, sometimes if that violence happens within the context of other individuals being present, that may have an impact on them. We also have seen childhood neglect as an experience that leads to folks experiencing trauma. Having a family member or someone that you know is close to you that lives with a mental health or substance use disorder. Also experiencing and witnessing violence in the community or while you're serving in the military. And we know that because we've worked with many folks who are veterans that have come back from different spaces in combat. And sadly, that stays with folks for a really, really, really long time, if not their whole life, and not have access to ways to explore how to address the trauma that comes from that and heal it can be really challenging here in the United States. And then poverty and systemic discrimination are also some of the examples of trauma that we have seen in our practice in the work that we do.
Tanagra, can I just
Yes,
say
can
one
always.
thing about, thank you, is so, and I think, I'm assuming everybody in the audience gets this, but I think it is important to reiterate is the significance of emotional abuse. There was that old saying, sticks and stones will break my bones, names will never hurt me, but they do.
Yes.
And so I think it's really important to keep that in mind. And also the experience of bullying. And certainly now more than ever, given the 24, because of social media and people's phones and that sort of thing, that the constant sort of pressure that people can experience 24/7. And so I think that's something to also keep in mind.
Absolutely. And I think that those are great examples, Joe, because I think we tend to minimize the words that are said to folks without really understanding the depth of the impact that those words have. I had participants said to me, I'd rather have him punch me or hit me, because people would see that and they would believe me when I said to them that I was experiencing violence. And yet when I share with folks all the things the psychological warfare that participants were subjected to, people didn't believe them because it's just words. Well, it's not just words. If you are listening to those words being repeated, right, and delivered by someone that you have a close connection and relationship to, those are really painful and harmful, right? But because it's invisible in a way, we don't believe it, right? So I think it's really important to uplift that. Thank you, Joe. And then
Sorry, one other thing.
Sorry.
Sorry. As you were talking, it made me is the issue of neglect, and sort of obviously there's the neglect of the daily, food and proper housing and that sort of thing, but also emotional neglect, and that can cause, I think, or lead to higher risk for individuals who experience emotional neglect. And they find somebody who, yes, they may be abusive, but they pay attention to me. They care about me. And
Yeah.
so I think that the neglect that they may have experienced as children put them more susceptible to kind of getting involved in unhealthy relationships.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Joe.
Yeah.
And so thinking about, trauma, moving from trauma from individual to the structural, historical, intergenerational trauma, SAMHSA also speaks to us about this. And it tells us that whole communities, or communities as a whole, can experience trauma. We know that. And we know that natural disaster is one example of how communities may experience trauma, whether it's flood, fire, or hurricanes. We also know that communities as a whole can experience trauma when circumstances are inflicted from one group to another. And here we think the war on drugs, usurping people's homelands, forcibly relocating people, servitude, mass incarceration, or ongoing exposure to violence in the community. And we also know that trauma is, in fact, passed from one generation to the other in what we know as intergenerational trauma. There's this field of study around epigenetics, which it tells us that that trauma is embedded in our DNA, right? So what does it mean to be a part of a third or fourth generation of a community, of a family, right, that has experienced and continues to live with a trauma, right? So keeping that in mind when we're working with people is really, really important, because a lot of times we have this idea that if people were stronger, if they pulled themselves up from their bootstraps, if they just made up their mind and were strong and chose to do X, Y, and Z, they would. And if we approach that way, we are completely ignoring the structural, historical, intergenerational trauma that people live with, and that is very much present, and that has a huge role in people's ability to make decisions, to make choices, to make changes, and to take ownership of their life.
So what we'd like to do now is throw out a few questions to people, participants here. So, and for those of you who work with people around who may be survivors of domestic or sexual violence, sort of answering these questions in that context. So what are some physical reactions to trauma? What are some emotional reactions to trauma? And then what are some ways that trauma can impact someone's ability to engage in services, which I think is also very important to consider. To the most extreme, dissociation, yes. Uh, Inability to sleep, eating habits, hyper-startled response, numbing, inability to focus, exaggerated startle response, agitation, chronic medical issues, attachment issues may develop, and obviously lack of trust interferes with treatment, yes. Feeling on edge all the time, difficulty concentrating, physical reactions, panic attacks, emotional reactions, anger, fear of being vulnerable, self-harm, hypervigilance, anxiety, depression, physical appetite changes, sleep changes, emotional irritability, anxious depression, trauma, injuries and withdrawal, anxiety, difficulty trusting, denial, difficulty with relationship, in and out of treatment. Yes, fainting, substance use, self-harm, lack of trust, substance misuse, lack of sense of deservingness. That's a really good one. Somatic pain, yes, yes. Substance use, GI issues, isolation. Great responses here. I notice anxiety and mistrust, avoidance, and inability to connect with others. I notice that some clients begin to yell or are unable to emotionally regulate and end up thinking they are abusive. I think some people think that they will be judged or that they may leave treatment without notice. Yes. Feeling unsafe in their own bodies, eating disorders, social withdrawal, eating concerns, not trusting and isolating, difficulty reclaiming sexuality. Yes. It will impact the family. Yes. Great. I did want to, because there was a reference to it above. So also to think about a lot of this in terms of attachment theory, because that will help people understand how people may engage in services. And so it really is a lens into understanding people's emotional and relationship vulnerability. And I just came across this article about attachment sort of styles for people engaged in substance use treatment in a program. And, again, probably not surprising to all of you that a common one was actually avoidant attachment style. So if someone has an avoidant attachment style and they're entering therapy where, there's an expectation to have a certain amount of vulnerability, that's going to be very frightening. And that could lead to what you see in terms of people dropping out of treatment. So when we think about stigma, and again, think about this in the context. So we're certainly bringing this up in the context of, or we have brought it up in the past in the context of people using substances, but also now people who are victims of or survivors of domestic and sexual violence. The stigma that's out there about them. People with whatever are incapable, fragile, dangerous, and cannot recover. This happened, so I'm dating myself, but back in the early 90s, there was a very famous case of a woman in Fall River who was raped in a bar. And the response of many in the community was basically blaming her. She shouldn't have been in there. That she was looking for trouble, that she kind of put herself in this environment, so it was her fault that this happened. And so there is that stigma, and certainly as probably you all can point to when people have gone to court against their sort of their perpetrators, that the attorneys representing the defendants will kind of obviously tear down the person, which makes them then harder to want to go through the court system. But even the court system itself, the prejudices that may be happening there, and then the discrimination, both socially and then structurally around. And so the social and structural are related to people with, oftentimes with people with substance use issues. So I don't want to live next door to them. The NIMBY, not in my backyard, to have treatment services, halfway houses in certain communities because we don't want that kind around us. And then employers not supporting or hiring people with recovery. Education lacks effective supports. Health insurance still struggles with, I think, providing equal coverage to people with addictions. So it's really a social process which can reinforce relations of power and control, and leads to status loss and discrimination for the stigmatized. So again, I think that slowly has changed, but don't sort of speak out about the violence that you experienced. And so that, I think, and so that kind of reinforces the power and control of the powers that be. And then stigma is the belief, right? And then as the outcome of that belief, discrimination is the action that occurs.
So what are the ways in which stigma and trauma are related, right? If we think about the relationship between stigma and trauma, what would be some of the things that come to mind to folks? If you can share in the chat. Yeah, there's shame. Thank you, Nikita. We internalize it. Thank you, Madison. The belief that people could leave if they wanted to bad enough. There's shame, as Shell's saying. We feel the need to be silent. Let's see here. We blame the victim, that blame the victim view, which can be internalized. The client's family telling them that they are always playing the victim, that someone deserves to be abused. Absolutely, Jamie. There's which is related to what Jordan's saying, because that's rooted in judgment. We hide, right? There's a lack of trust. Again, blaming the victim. We isolate ourselves. We internalize a sense of lack of deservingness of respect and love, which is so pernicious. And we ignore our needs and feelings as legitimate. So we don't trust ourselves, right? Like that process of not trusting starts there. Shame can silence a person, makes us invisible. It's a continuous cycle of experiencing trauma, then experiencing the stigma, and we gaslight ourselves. Absolutely. So experiencing stigma can certainly lead us to experience trauma, right? Experiencing stigma can be really traumatizing, and trauma can heighten stigma, because many times the reactions that participants may have that are stemming from trauma are reactions that we stigmatize from folks because they make us uncomfortable, whether it's substance use, where it's speaking too loud, where it's crying too much, or becoming hysterical. Many of the things that you mentioned are things that are not looked upon well, right? Because it's a sense of the person is out of control. So we then stigmatize that person further by the reactions that they're having or the responses that they're having to their experience of trauma. Manuel is sharing stigma and judgment can make existing trauma worse, push people away from getting help. Society gets stuck in the cycles of making those harms shared, shamed, and told that there's their fault. And that is a family matter, which is, it's this thing of like the private stays private, right? Los trapos sucios se lavan en casa, dirty laundry you wash at home, right? You don't speak about these things. This is in the domestic realm. That's why we have in this field begun to use the word intimate partner violence, which is also, again, intimate in the intimacy, right? So it's behind closed walls. So how do we name these things that are not intimate and not domestic, right? Because they're certainly having an impact outside of that realm. It affects people's executive functions. Thank you, everyone. Those are really great sort of examples of how stigma and trauma are related. And now we're going to dive a little bit deeper into this conversation by looking at the intersection of survivors using drugs, right? And the first thing that I want to say before we dive into these questions is that for many survivors, substance use has been a tool that has helped them stay alive one more day. So here again comes this, for us, this opportunity to practice radical neutrality and acceptance, and as Joe said and encouraged us to utilize motivational interviewing to really come from a place of curiosity and asking questions about how has this behavior found its way to this person's life, and how has this behavior supported them and maybe also harmed them, but give ourselves room for that complexity in that conversation. So with that being said, what are some harms that come from using drugs? And we specifically want to hear harms that can come to survivors of intimate and sexual violence. So what are some of the harms that can come from use drugs, and what are some specific harms that we can see in the lives of survivors of intimate and sexual violence? And so I see memory loss, alienation from our close and personal relationships, increased vulnerability. It impacts our health, so it can lead to poor health. Absolutely, Deborah. There's a loss of control, right? What else? Help me, Joe, here. Let's see.
Physical health is compromised. Financial isolation, detachment, isolation can lead to death. Absolutely. Involvement from CPS,
Yes.
Child Protective Services, financial difficulties, put in unsafe situations, numbing. Strained relationships can anchor survivor to abuser if that is their supplier. Absolutely. Not wanting to use alone. Yes. Difficulty trusting elders, alienate them from support systems, isolation from self, decreases their ability to think clearly, and poor judgment. Yeah. Loss of social supports or relationships with people that reenact trauma. Yes. Isolation. Yeah. Unable to manage daily stressors, risk of self-harm, or putting yourself in an unsafe situation. Really good.
And so thank you for sharing all of that. I think all of those are rooted in sexism, in inequality and discrimination against women in general, which intersects and then exacerbates the harms that people who use drugs face, right? So I've seen a lot, like we need to look at this from that intersectional lens, from the lens of social cultural factors. I have worked with many survivors who were in relationship with a partner, for example, and had children themselves. And I've seen the system say to the survivor, you will not have any contact with your child. And on the other hand, they will allow contact from the father, from the parent who's a male, who also is engaged in substance use, right? So again, here, the thing that defines this, the thing that makes this different is the fact that one of them is a female who using substances and a mother, and one of them is a father using substances and it's a male. And so the system tends to punish and shame further female identified folks. So that sexism and that inequality, and that discrimination that women experience also is heightened when those women use drugs and when they're also in relationships of intimate partner violence. So that piece for us is really important to keep in mind, that these harms will be magnified just because of the body that these people lived in, right? And it's important for us also to consider this all these other aspects. Men are, yes, go ahead, Joe.
Sorry. No, go ahead.
No, you go.
Oh, okay. Well, I work, and maybe because of my specialty in working with people with anger, practically all of my clients are men. And so I think to really think about, obviously, the issue of men being victims of violence as well, and oppressed by the patriarchy, and suffer its impacts. And men have a harder time getting support or disclosing their experience with intimate sexual violence and trauma. And a couple of things there. One of them is that I think what happens is that men have a harder time. Obviously this generalization here, but I think in many ways men have a harder time sort of talking with even friends, family members about what they experienced. So that sense of isolation and shame is really, really very strong. And that somehow that sort of being a victim is really very alienating for themselves. And I'm working with this one man who constantly, he's getting a little better, but this idea of asking for help is a sign of weakness, because this idea that you should just suck it up and take care of it yourself. Part of that was a message from his mostly his father about, and these are his parents were immigrants from South Asia, and so but that mentality that you've got to take care of it yourself. And so he struggles with this when, he has, he's got a partner and two children, and his partner travels a lot. And so, so he's oftentimes parenting by himself and not feeling like he can sort of express his concerns about that. So I think that that's really something to keep in mind when you're working with men.
Absolutely. And that men also experience violence, and that men that experience intimate or sexual violence may be really hesitant, as Joe was sharing with us, of disclosing that because of patriarchy, because of the violence that patriarchy imposes in males, where it's like the sense of you have to be strong, you have to be dignified, you have to be, that can happen to you. Like that stuff that happens to women, and you want to distance yourself from being a woman. So when that stuff happens, it can be really harmful for folks to carry that with them and not be able to process it. So thank you for uplifting that, Joe.
Thank you.
I think that's really, really important. In the context of drug use and women, one of the things that we have found through our work is that women face unique obstacles in terms of accessing services and treatment. First, there's discrimination and the stigma. Right? First of all, even acknowledging that you need to go to treatment, right? That can set up like a cascade of situations that can have a really harmful impact on folks. And so many times they're hesitant to even acknowledge that they may need support. We know that the systems are built from an androcentric lens, which means that they were designed and built for men. So they're not built to support the specific and unique needs of women. I had a colleague of ours that had gone into a treatment program, and it was her and two other women. It was three women, and they had uteruses and they menstruated, and the program had no hygiene products for people that had uteruses. So how you say it in plural in English? Uteri, whatever. They all bled. They all had menses, right? And so they did not have anything for them there, right? And so even that seems like a small thing. It's a huge thing for someone, because that happens to us. That have you, if you still have that your uterus and you bleed, it happens once a month, right? And so that it's like you have to go and ask and all of that. There's a lack of childcare for those that are parenting, right? And need to access treatment. And the treatments that are prescribed have been tested on men, so they really don't take into account hormonal changes, the composition of women's bodies, etc. We also know that men are more likely to use drugs and women are more likely to be diagnosed with substance use disorder, right? So this means also that there is this issue of sexism here, right? That somehow when we normalize the use of men of substances, but when women use them, we immediately then go into the medical industrial complex and we label them as addicts, as having a substance use disorder issue, right? And so it doesn't mean that because you have more diagnoses, that doesn't mean that people have more chaotic use. In fact, we need to look at this through the lens of sexism and misogyny, right? Many times. Many people are not diagnosed at all, and have no chaotic use, and many people have chaotic use, and the diagnosis doesn't really reflect what they need in terms of services and support, right? This is me yet, right?
Yes, yes.
Yes. Other things to keep in mind. Again, science is, we need to look at who's doing the studies, who's important, right? Where are we getting the data? There are not enough studies, and there's not enough data on drugs and women. Also important to note that all the data assumes that we have found that women are cisgender, so this leaves out women who are trans. It doesn't have, there's not enough data or studies around women who are queer who use drugs. We usually get lumped in together. And so I think it's really, really important also to just understand that what we have is not good enough, because it's not really looking at the whole broad spectrum of who are women and who are women who we may be working with when we're offering them services.
So actually, Tanagra, I'm thinking maybe this would be a good time to take
Yes.
the 5-minute break, but also
Yes.
just to kind of, could you go back to your previous slide?
See.
Thank you. So the other thing obviously here is also the underrepresentation of women, Black and brown women in these studies, absolutely as well, and those kind of cultural factors that may play a role that again has been ignored through the years when we've been doing this research.
Thank you, Joe. So I think this is a great time to take our break. So we'll come back in 5 minutes. So we'll come back right at 1. Would that be okay with folks? She'll have a little bit longer of a break. So we'll come back right at 1. See you shortly. Okay, so I think we are ready to be back, right?
Yes.
Now we'll look briefly at some compounding factors for survivors of intimate partner violence. And so thinking about, the fact that women, like, we live in a society that has become very violent, right? And that many of our participants at some point or another, sadly, will have experienced sexual violence of some sort of way in their lifetime. That 51% of folks that are female and that have also experienced sexual violence have been abused by an intimate partner violence. That folks that are male and have experienced sexual violence were experienced that violence at the hands of acquaintances of folks that they know. It's very scary also to think about the fact that both men and women will at some point, a high percentage of folks will experience stalking at some point in their lives. And that's just really, when we think about the degree of violence that our participants, clients or patients may be exposed to, no wonder, why some of our participants may use substances to help them cope with some of those experiences. And so we know that we have higher rates of intimate partner violence for folks that create trauma. We also have seen people who use drugs experience police abuses, including sexual and physical violence, female identified folks, that is, in this case, and folks that are reluctant to access harm reduction services, even if they are available, because of the shame and stigma that we were mentioning earlier, right? And because of experiences with systems that have been harmful and violent to them, like the medical industrial complex, right? If you have an experience there that can lead to an experience of trauma as well, then you may be reluctant to access these services because they're perceived to be connected or in relationship and you don't trust them, right? Because they come from or connected to systems that already have caused harm to people.
So when we obviously then, with all of this, and I think people already made reference to it in the chat, that there is a high correlation between survivors of domestic violence and sexual violence and substance use disorder. It's a disease that affects one's brain and behavior. It creates an inability to control the use of substances, and survivors are at particularly risk for developing substance use disorders due to the high rate of PTSD within the community. And so what happens is that when you combine the PTSD symptoms with a lack of alternative or lower risk coping skills, this is going to lead to substance use for relief. And according to the American Addiction Center, survivors are 13 times more likely to misuse alcohol and 26 times more likely to misuse drugs than those who have not experienced sexual abuse. And so what we're talking about here is obviously co-occurring disorders. And I think the statistics, it ranges anywhere. I've seen anywhere between 80% to close to almost 100% of women who have substance use disorders have some sort of history of trauma. And so I think it's important, obviously, when you're working with a woman or woman identified, is to really explore that with the individual. So, so understanding substance use disorder and survivors, it's never as simple as just quitting cold turkey, or somehow it's the survivor's fault. I would also kind of point, and I think Tanagra made reference to that, what kind, that there oftentimes is a lack of good treatment services for these individuals. So you can say, and then the insurance limitations, how many times, somebody is seeking help, and I say, well, so what is your insurance? Because that's going to determine where you go for treatment. or where you can go for treatment. And so you add another layer in terms of accessing services. So I think that makes it also very difficult for survivors.
And I also wanted to say, Joe, and add to that, if I can, that
Right.
the reason that I get really excited and I am really hopeful when we have spaces like this is the fact that there's also a lack of therapists that are both substance use informed and informed in the nuances of domestic and sexual violence, right? If we, to support survivors, you know, goodwill is important, but also be able to come from a place of understanding or having a background or some sort of place to start from is super important. And so having a space here today where we have about 200 folks here willing to have these conversations and to really think about, you know, how can we be better by learning from each other to support survivors is just really heartening, right? It's good to see. There's hope for folks that are moving through the world and are survivors also experiencing substance use, that they may encounter folks in this room to support them through the process.
Yeah, thank you, Tanagra. Very good point to raise. So again, and I think a number of people in the chat have already sort of talked about this, is that survivors often turn to substances for a number of reasons, basically a coping mechanism. Or a way to kind of just escape trauma. It reduces feelings of isolation, loneliness. Maybe it's the one time that they have a community, and so that they're able to connect with people. Obviously, the self-medication aspect of it, and it can boost confidence and self-esteem. And so what I would ask people to keep in mind is Gabor Mate's observation that we don't ask why the addiction, we ask why the pain. And so that I think is really important to always keep in mind when working with survivors.
And so this is just a reminder, right, that folks that have experienced sexual violence, coping with that trauma, navigating that experience, may also use substances. The same goes for folks that have experienced intimate partner violence. That substance use can become a space where it's safety, a space where folks can find relief, a space where folks can find also a way to control the experience that they had, whether by not thinking about it or by being able to find joy and pleasure in their own bodies, right? And so again, there's an intersection here that is important for us to highlight and acknowledge. I think that the other piece that we wanted to uplift, and this is again where the radical neutrality and acceptance, a piece of sort of thinking about the working in those ethical gray areas is important. Not every situation where there's substance use and intimate partner violence is rooted in substance use coercion. We cannot assume that. And we have seen that survivors have experienced coercion in regards to substance use, right? Coercive tactics that the partner may use to control that person, as Jill was saying. There are relationships, people enter relationships as equal partners, and there is a consensual agreement that there's pleasure and connection with one partner administering the substances to another. And if that's consensual and that is agreed upon, then there should not be an issue. When what we see happen is when it becomes non-consensual, when it is used to control someone, whether it's access to the substances, whether it is to force someone to use substances that they don't want to use, or to force them or deny the substances, which is the other piece, right? It can be substances, it can also be medication too. So thinking about, you know, this coercive tactics as a way of power and control to be exercised from one partner towards another, that can be potentially really dangerous and harmful to that participant experiencing the violence. And I
Can
just wanted to,
sorry, Tanagra,
Go.
again, I'm really dating myself, although it was even a movie before I was even born. But it's a movie, very old movie called The Day of Wine and Roses. And in the movie, the male partner sort of gets the female partners to start drinking.
Mm,
And they develop an alcohol problem, both of them. He ends up decides that he doesn't want to do it anymore and becomes abstinent. And he basically abandons the woman, and she ends up dying because of her addiction. And so, kind of just related, again, old school, very old school movie, but interesting, kind of related to what you were saying, Tanagra.
yeah. Absolutely, and we've seen how substance use has been weaponized against participants, right? Like abusive partners have called CPS to, alert them that the partner has been using substances as a way to harm them and to control them and to scare them. And so we know this happens, and I'm really grateful that the National Center on Domestic and Sexual Violence took this initially. There's the Duluth Center, which is in Minnesota, have been pioneers in really thinking about domestic violence, and they developed what is known as the Duluth Wheel, which is the power and control wheel that many of you maybe have seen. And so out of that, other organizations doing this work have adapted that wheel. And this power and control model for women's substance use, I find really, really helpful, because it really helps us to look at how power and control can look like when a person who's female identified is using substances and is in a relationship. So we have it here to share with you. We can also find the link so that you can maybe print it or have access to it to use it if you want to review it. But it's really looking at the use of physical abuse, using isolation, minimizing and blaming, all of these different aspects, specifically in the context of substance use. And so I find this really, really helpful to use with participants too, just to help them see, thank you, Joe, some of the some of the ways in which I think thank you for these
Yes.
thank you for these some of the ways in which this can play out in their day-to-day lives. And so we see also some health disparities that are connected to, and all of this is connected to the fact that we don't have enough studies really looking at the impacts of this issue specifically on women identified folks. We know that folks that are in female identified folks that are in situations of domestic sexual violence have a higher prevalence or incidence of bloodborne infections. We have seen studies in the in the EU, I'm sorry, I was reading that backwards. EU, there's a higher prevalence to HIV amongst women who use drugs versus men who use drugs. This may be because women don't have the same access to new sterile equipment or harm reduction services or the information that they need, or maybe many times the partner is injecting and using tools that are not sterile, and in using them on the partner, and they're not aware. So it's really important to think about also the vulnerabilities that are faced by female identified survivors who use drugs, particularly in the context of HIV or Hep C infections, co-occurring infections.
And one other thing too, Tanagra, around the health disparities, just so people, and some people may aware, around alcohol, women tend to have more medical health issues, and for different reasons around their misuse of alcohol than men do. So I just wanted to mention that.
It's like how we metabolize it too.
Yes, yeah.
Absolutely. And there's very specific and particular barriers to service when it comes to thinking of survivors of female identified survivors of intimate partner violence that also use substances. Again, some of the structural barriers are lack of childcare if they have children. Services may be in unsafe or indiscreet locations, particularly in small communities. If you're seen going into a building, everybody knows your business. They know what you're there, what you're going to do. So it may not feel safe for them to access services in those settings. We may see also rigid service schedules. Again, there's no flexibility, so it makes it hard for people to access. There's long waits and bureaucratic hurdles, and lack of sufficient services provision, right? Like we're offering like a small small piece of what services can be offered, but we're not looking at the complexity of what it means to offer services to female identified folks, right? How can we create more holistic services that really encompass that person's whole experience? And then regards to, and I think of this, for example, offering sexual and reproductive health services, while we also offer harm reduction services, mental health services, and other physical health services. And then in terms of personal barriers, we see, fear of partner violence, accessing treatment, or saying to your partner, I no longer want to use, or I want to change my use, and then that detonating violence from that partner because they see the desire to stop using as a way to also stop the relationship or shift the power dynamic in the relationship. There's a fear of losing children to government bodies, right? Many times it's a huge fear where there is like actual children that have been born and they're living and being raised, to also women who are pregnant and maybe in trying to figure out how to stop using when they have found out that they're pregnant. The fear that if they say, hey, again, why we need people like you here in this room to be able to support, those survivors in being able to articulate what they need, and also find folks within the broader medical field that are willing to support women or people who are pregnant, who have been using substances and no longer want to use substances when they have found out that they're pregnant, to be able to do that successfully, because many can't find that support. There's personal financial concerns. If I'm the sole breadwinner and I'm the sole caretaker and I also have to access services, what does that mean for me in terms of my ability to continue to provide for my family? And fear of losing their partnership. For many participants, they have entered this relationship. Substance use has become a part of this relationship, and there's a fear that, again, if I choose to stop using, that means that my partner will no longer want to continue to be with me, and what that means for me in terms of support, of connection, etc. So those are some of the barriers that we have heard articulated from participants in regards to accessing services, harm reduction services.
So,
No, you go. No.
So when we think about, and again, I think we've touched upon these issues already, but so again, the co-occurring sort of aspects of victims of rape or sexual assault, and I also think domestic violence, but certainly eating disorders, which probably it's a topic all in itself. Certainly PTSD, substance use disorders, depression, and anxiety are all going to be sort of issues that there's going to be more of a risk for people developing. So what can we provide, right? So when we think about this, to kind of the trauma-informed approach to care, so we want to shift the focus from what's wrong with you to what happened to you, right? So again, getting away from that stigmatizing sort of perspective that has happened and that can still happen. So trauma-informed care is an approach in the human service field that assumes that an individual is more likely than not to have a history of trauma. I also think it's important for us to do our own sort of self-reflection, right? And our own personal experiences with trauma. Because that's certainly going to have an impact on how we deliver services to the individuals that we work with. And then again, the intention of trauma-informed care is not to treat symptoms, but it is to provide support services that's accessible and appropriate for those who have experienced trauma. So they're really, I think, two different things. Although I guess what I would just like to say that I think, unfortunately, trauma-informed care has become a buzzword.
Mm-hmm.
that it's talked about a lot, but I don't. I think sometimes we pay lip service to it, but I think we fall short in really having it sort of play out, especially in our in the systems agencies that we work in. And so, you know, so for instance, we can talk about trauma-informed care, but support staff are not supported in learning about these things around trauma and how people may show up to an agency and sort of giving these support staff appropriate skills to kind of work with these individuals.
And I think going, along with what Joe was saying, it's not only we're setting up people to fail, participants to fail, clients to fail, when staff doesn't have the tools that they need to be able to provide the services in the way that they would want to. We can't expect folks to show up and provide trauma-informed care rooted services if they don't have an understanding on how to do that. If they are not able to recognize that what seems like an outburst or a screaming or crying behind that behavior, there is trauma, right? So thinking about how do we support our staff to become trauma informed, instead of being problem focused, which is many times where we come to, when we don't have the tools that we need, how can we move folks to be more trauma informed? So instead of saying to a participant, oh, you're being oversensitive or reactive, right? We may think instead trauma is being re-triggered and is resulting in strong emotions, right? There's a reframing where we see the person and not the behavior, right? And we're not shaming or stigmatizing the behavior. Instead of saying this person is exhibiting aggressive behavior, it is always aware of potential threats and relies on anger to stay safe. You see how that is different? How I can see now a person who's afraid and fearful, and anger is a tool. It's like, como se dice, like, oh my God, it's a shield of protection, right? That they can use to care for themselves and maybe for others. If I say aggressive behavior, I don't go into the nuances and I don't see the person. I just see that behavior. Refuses to accept help, which is non-compliant, right? We've heard that before. Shame is triggered, going to what Joe was saying earlier of your client, right? That was having a really hard time asking for help because of the cultural context, because of the gender that he was, the nature of like his situation, right? Shame is triggered when help is offered, right? It's not that I don't want help. It's like I feel really embarrassed because I've been told that I should be able to do this by myself, and I feel really stupid and dumb and incapable, and that's not a good feeling. No motivation, right? Maybe has depression or PTSD, and avoidance is a way to manage discomfort, right? Avoids people. Instead of thinking about that, what about thinking that this is a way to manage stress and retriggering, right? If I avoid, also to have control. It's a way to regain control, particularly folks that have experienced trauma. Control is really, really important, right? Having control over our environment, over ourselves, and particularly people with intimate partner violence histories and sexual violence histories. So avoiding people means that I am protecting myself, because there's no way that if I avoid people and I am in this cocoon that someone is going to re-trigger me or cause me a stress or harm me in any way. And then when folks seem disengaged, right? Someone could be experiencing dissociation from trauma. Again, thinking about being trauma informed in the way that we do our work and how we approach conversations with participants, patients, or clients can be really, really helpful to, again, help us center the person, and also for us to be able to have a departing point to ask questions, right? To really get to building a rapport with the client, and also really figuring out from them what it is that is happening, what they want, what is concerning, what they need, what are their skills, what are the areas that they want to strengthen and develop. And we will share all the slides. Yes. I just want to say, because I saw something, we're going to share all the slides so you'll have all the documents and the materials.
Right. Those last 2 points, the avoids people and disengaged, again, many of you may be familiar that a lot of programs, especially inpatient or partial hospitalization programs, are very group focused. And, I do groups. I'm a big fan of groups. But if you're working with people with high levels of trauma, high experiences of trauma, they're going to be sort of not so keen on participating in group. Unfortunately, I think it's sometimes framed as they're being resistant or, disengaged or not motivated. But we have to appreciate sort of what it's maybe like for them to be in a group. Oftentimes, people they've never met before, right? Especially an inpatient, and you're asking them to engage and participate. And so we have to be, I think, sensitive and aware of that.
Yeah, I think also respect different levels of engagement and participation in those settings too,
Yes.
right? Maybe someone is really
Yes.
quiet and maybe not sharing, and yet they're there. That doesn't mean that they're not listening and integrating, right? And building
Right.
trust to feel safe. Because maybe that person, every time they spoke out, they were told to shut up because they were dumb and stupid, right?
Right.
And nothing that they
Right.
said made sense. And so I think that's a
Right.
really good point too, Joe, of like
Yes.
for us to help people navigate and set up people to succeed in those settings too.
Right.
In terms of what you can expect from the group
Right.
and what is the
Yes.
expectation of participation, and what is, if it's just showing up and sitting here, and when you feel compelled to speak, then that's great, right? And if you want to share, you can share in writing or verbally, I don't know, but just helping people to, like, when you know what to expect, you can then make choices for yourself in terms of how, and you have more control, right? You feel more in control of the situation. I think that piece is really important.
Right.
And we also wanted to name, right, and when we're looking at sexual violence prevention and intimate partner violence prevention, working from a trauma-informed approach is crucial and vital to do this work in a way that is effective. And that we need to bring that lens into the work that we do. We should all be working from a trauma-informed lens, regardless of who we're working with, right? It doesn't matter what community that person is. Most likely they may have experienced trauma or witnessed trauma, and or health trauma for someone else. And so thinking about, the intersectional approaches to this work, which are really, really, really important, and bring those intersectional approaches in trauma-informed care, and really asking participants, who we know have experienced sexual violence or intimate partner violence, right? What it is that we can do for them, what is that they need from us in terms of the services, can also feel really powerful and empowering for those participants as well. And here we are.
So before we move on to the last part of our presentation, again, discussion question, people can put their answers, because obviously you all are coming with a certain level of experience. So how can a trauma-informed approach be helpful when working with survivors of sexual and intimate partner violence that also use substances? Sense of control in a non-judgmental environment. Yes, thank you, Alexia. Person-centered, yes. Feeling heard, reducing shame, awareness of triggers, build trust, yes. I would be curious about the story that the person tells themselves. Yes, meeting the client where they are, of course. Could be a safe space for them for the first time. It helps us avoid blaming the victim and re-traumatizing the person. Keep showing up for them, acceptance where they are, knowing their behaviors are informed by experiences that we may know nothing about. I just want to emphasize that. Last year we talked about cultural humility, but I think that humility sort of expands into all sorts of other areas. And it's okay not to know. And it's okay to let the client know that you don't know. And I think in some ways that's modeling for them. Support system building trust. There can be trauma in the substance use journey itself. Non-stigmatized approach, feeling supported. Support versus trying to fix. Yes, a collaborative approach to make important decisions about their own lives. Understanding impact of person's earlier experiences on their current slide. Safe space. Yeah, great. Thank you. A stance of gentle curiosity helps us avoid playing the expert so we can see the client as the expert in their own life. Absolutely. Yeah, great. Thank you.
I think is it you or me, Joe?
That's the next two are you.
Someone?
Next three are you. Yes.
Okay. So we offer also, I think also we can offer folks, spaces that are safe, such as drop-in centers. I think that those are really powerful for community building and connecting them to those spaces. If they come to you in your practice, can always a sense of community, you know, it's so crucial, right? The opposite of addiction is connection, right? The opposite of violence is connection. So thinking about, you know, how do we help people find those spaces of connection can be really crucial. Helping people get connected to community organizing and policy change is also super important. That can lead to a sense of empowerment of like actively I can do something to change policies or practices that may not be helpful to the experiences that our community is facing. Supporting people with housing or legal services also can be something that we can offer, as well as safer drug use and other overdose prevention other materials and overdose prevention materials. And we can that by connecting people to harm reduction programs, where they can also get safer sex education. For those of you that don't know what a bad date sheet is, that is a document that is used in the sex work community to help sex workers keep each other safe. It is a place where sex workers that have had bad experiences with dates, they can share crucial information such as make of car, license plate, and any other sort of important information about the person that was the bad date, so that other folks that engage in sex work can avoid that person. Is a way to keep the community safe and that information out there. But we can connect people to comprehensive medical and health services. All of these are things that, you know, harm reduction programs do, that we can connect clients and patients to these programs to help them find connection and support. And I see here, housing would eliminate many behavioral health symptoms and diagnosis. The housing crisis is a real serious issue affecting folks. Yes, absolutely, Cheryl. That is one of the things that we have seen participants and clients find most destabilizing. And particularly if you're a survivor of intimate partner violence and you have to flee your home, because many times what we say to survivors is you and your kids need to leave the home, and the person who committed the violence stays in the home. So we are destabilizing the person who's already in a situation of vulnerability. What that would look like if instead of saying that, we would remove the person who is perpetrating the violence and help them and move them into a space where they can get the support and the therapy that they need, instead of forcing the person who's most vulnerable to, because of societal issues such as, you know, sexism and misogyny, put them in more vulnerability by kicking them out of their house, right? And moving them into spaces that may not be safe for them, or that they're removed from supports, community supports too, right? When someone is forced out of a community, they need to go somewhere else that is new. So how do I build community and find support here, right? While I'm taking care of my kids and dealing, if I have them, and dealing with the violence that I experienced, etc. So I think that's a really good point that you bring up. Absolutely.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Madison.
Yeah. And also, you know, Chanaga, I was just thinking the bad date sheet, you know, I know you mentioned that it's often used with sex workers, but I can see using this with clients who have gotten involved with really bad relationships. And so kind of adapting it to, okay, what's a way of sort of thinking about it next time you're out on a date or meeting somebody, what to keep in mind, that sort of thing. It just made me think about that. So anyway. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think folks have turned that also into providers that may not be helpful to them, right? It's the word of mouth, but also saying, hey, in this community, some of these providers we're rating providers. We had a group of participants with great providers, and say these providers show up and they treat us with dignity and care and respect. And these are spaces where I don't recommend you go, because that's not the care that you will get. So again, it absolutely can be, it's a way of protecting community and protecting each other. And thank you, Madison, for sharing that. And then someone is asking, what can be done now with folks that may be deported because they don't have their documents? Yes, absolutely. Beryl, that is a really great point, because it's not only happening now, because also we're seeing the harms that this fear is causing in people. They're not going to receive any care because they're afraid that they'll be deported. So we've seen a lot of harm reduction programs where there's What they have used to have participants that were immigrants come in for services, that they have disappeared, they have gone underground. And that is just really challenging, because the fear is really real, right? We are seeing it happen in Los Angeles, where folks are being just like taken from schools, taken from their homes, taken from everywhere, right? And so I think that that's a good point of conversation for when we have the space for questions. I would love to hear from other folks when we get there, right? What are your thoughts in terms of what can we do about that specific situation, because I think it's really important to acknowledge. And as I was saying earlier, the principles of harm reduction in the very beginning, I said that for me, the principles of harm reduction and the principles of healing center engagement are very similar and very alike, because they're rooted again in the person, in the human being that is in front of us. It's about rehumanizing people. It is about really thinking about, with curiosity and care, who is this human being in front of me, and what may be the circumstances that have led them to us here today, right? It's thinking about how do we build safety for folks, or help them be safer. I don't think people can be 100% safe, sadly, but we can help people be safer. How can I build safer spaces for my clients, my patients, my participants? And I do that by developing, by being transparent, right, with my clients, and by building trust with them and being trustworthy. I do what I say I'm going to do. When I don't know, I say, hey, I don't know, but I'm going to, if you give me, like Joe said, like, if you give me the opportunity, I'm going to go out and find out more. And I will come back and share with you what I have found out to see if that works for you. And if you have the information, would you mind sharing it with me, so that then I can go and do more homework and make sure that when I come back, I have a deeper basis of understanding of what's happening. And that is about being transparent, right? What I can and cannot do, what I know and I don't know. It is about connecting people to peer supports. I think that that piece is so important. These experiences of violence can be so isolating, as you all mentioned and we've seen. And isolation is violence, because we are meant to be in community with each other. And when you have community, not only do you don't feel alone, you feel seen and you feel supported. And so those peer supports are crucial, right? And allow people to engage in a space of working with others from a place of collaboration and mutuality, not only with us as providers, but with other peers, other people that they're in relationship with. It gives people also the opportunity to exercise their empowerment, to use their voice, to practice choice, which is, again, such a way to strengthen people's self-esteem and self-efficacy, and is a way to fight against the impacts of trauma. And finally, we cannot do this in the absence of understanding the impact of cultural and historical issues have in people's lives. They have in our lives, they have in the systems that we are working in and under. So I'm thinking about, how do we can bring in these principles of healing center engagement to our day-to-day practice. Can be really helpful for us to set ourselves up to succeed, and our participants and our patients to succeed too. And I think, Joe, that you are walking
Is that
us
me?
through. Yeah,
Okay.
you, and
All
then
right.
the last.
Sorry.
Yes.
Okay.
No.
So this healing centered kind of perspective is the 3 R's. So realizing the widespread impact of trauma and potential pathways for healing, and thinking about that there are going to be different ways people are going to achieve healing, and what their definition of healing is. So kind of appreciating that. Obviously recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma, and that previous slide where Tanagra sort of showed how they may show up, like lack of motivation, aggressive behavior, that it could be a sign and symptom of trauma, and then respond by fully integrating all of these these kind of concepts into policies, practices, and settings. And to really what you want to, there is that sort of Hippocratic oath, do no harm. So we really want to actively resist traumatization. The other thing I would say is, I just ran across this construct or kind of term. It's called the sense of coherence constructs. and it reflects a person's ability to perceive life as manageable, comprehensive, and meaningful. And that people who have a stronger sense of coherence tend to have better stress management skills, improved healthy behavior, and less psychological stress. So thinking about those ways that we can help people try to make their lives a little bit more manageable or comprehensible or meaningful. And then in
Oh, sorry.
terms
Going
of
back.
what we can do is you know, especially those of you working in agencies and systems, does this policy have to exist? Why? How can we work within it? If it's something that you can't change, but maybe you can work around it. Practice meaningful engagement. And I think that's really important. I think, you know, whatever your psychotherapeutic approach may be, or approach may be, if it's IFS, if it's you know, DBT, if it's you know, EMDR, you know, don't overly rely on those kind of approaches, because it's really about sort of engaging with the client and how best do we engage with the client. And just to kind of again mention a quote from Carl Rogers, because I really think it encapsulates a lot of that aspect, is in my early professional years, I was asking the question, how can I treat, cure, or change this person? Now I would rephrase the question in this way: how can I provide a relationship which this person may use for their own personal growth? And really, that's what it's all about. Engage, I think Tanagra sort of talked about that, engage in genuine conversation and self-reflection. We always need to be self-reflecting, that sort of notion of deliberate practice. We have to practice community advocacy engagement, because we live in systems that are unfortunately impeding the work that we do. So we need to work at improving so there aren't these barriers. And then again, educate. Google is free, use it. Read from multiple resources. I would also kind of just second Tanagra, the National Harm Reduction Coalition is a great space, great website, has lots of resources, lots of different perspectives that I think are really important. So before we open up for questions, what are two things you have learned or are taking away from this session? I agree that using discretion regarding mandated reporting can be necessary. I'm concerned about violating law and the state code of ethics. How do you handle this conundrum? Okay, we can come back to that when we open it. Questions. We don't ask why the addiction, asking the pain. This was my takeaway. And the power control wheel was very helpful. Motivational interviewing is the starting point. Yes. Importance of creating a non-stigmatizing relationship with people who are using. The way substance use and survivors of violence intersect. I was just about to ask the same question of Deborah. How do we handle that? I appreciate the resources provided in these 3 sessions have been very helpful, and I've already provided some links to clients. Thank you, Marilyn. Primacy of engagement, non-judgment, importance of a trauma-informed care and being curious. Lots of great healing center approaches reinforce the importance of trauma-informed lanes and radical acceptance of where the client is. The participants know their situations best, and they need to be trusted in leading us in safety planning and harm reduction. Complexity and nuances of trauma-informed approach. Roger's quote, "In creating a relationship is even more important than any techniques you use." Asking, where does the pain come from? Understanding the impact of trauma on substance use. The sex workers have network and support
Yes.
system among each other, and they can be
Yes.
referred to. Check
Yeah.
out.
And I just want
Thank
to
you,
uplift.
Madison. Yes.
I just want to live for a second that harm reduction would be nothing without our sibling sex workers who have been part of this movement from the very beginning. And because of the nature of who they are, because of sexism and patriarchy, many times this harm reduction community has left them out, and we wouldn't be nothing without the contributions and the vision of folks in the sex work community. So I really appreciate folks that are lifting that, and I really appreciate the resources that have been shared. I would be remiss if I didn't name that.
Good, thank you, Tanagra. Understanding trauma, stigma, and safety planning, learning more about sex workers, removing blame and looking at causes rather than problems. Great, yeah. How patriarchy impacts on treatment for women, yeah. What assumptions I bring regarding the problem and solution, right? Do we, Tanagra, I'm gonna put you on the spot a little bit. The question about although I should let you know that last year, I think it was last year, we've been doing this now for a couple of years. One of them was on handling risk in
Yes.
working with substance use and harm reduction. And I would encourage you to look at that that video training that was done, because that could answer some questions you might have.
I also wanted to share with folks that I included the link. I just added the link to the slides that we used in this session in the chat box. So you should have access to them. And I see people are already in there. I think I think you're referring to the question about mandated reporting.
Yes, yes.
Right. Which I think is a really important question to raise, particularly if we are in states where mandated reporting is a reality. I think understanding, first of all, I think having good knowledge and a good grasp of what the actual law is and what it's asking us to do, it's important, because if I know what I have to do, then I can also think about the ways in which I can, within the box, I can sort of work from within that. What are the constraints that I have? And then what is my role? The other thing that I would say is harm reduction programs are really helpful in connecting with people and helping people address situations that we as mandate reporters may not be able to, but they can, because they are not constrained by the same regulations that some of us are as social workers who are licensed and practicing in the state. So I think that would be really important. The other thing is that there's a network of social workers that are organizing to challenge mandated reporting laws, because they are very, very harmful to clients, patients, and participants. And so I can look in a second, I'll look at the information of that network in case folks are interested and want to explore more, because they have put out, not only articles, arbitrator articles, but also they have a ton of information. And I think that information is really, really helpful to us as social workers to rethink and sort of like challenge those mandated reporting laws. So let me see if I can find that for folks in a second so I can share it.
And
Yes.
I would also, I guess I would also add that and again, part of it is holding the space for gray areas, but we also have to use our clinical judgment, right? And we don't want to dismiss that. And so when we're hearing a situation and we're kind of considering whether to report it or not, what harm could potentially come from that by reporting it, and in terms of the relationship that we have established with that person. So I would have people think about that, and clearly you want to sort of maybe seek consultation if you're making that decision to kind of hold it rather than report it. I think would be important, but we have to be, there have been cases, on my perspective, not from an extreme way, but where an issue has come up and I think, technically I probably should report this, but I decided not to because I don't think in the long run, it would be good for working with this individual. But also being aware if there's a ongoing repeated pattern, then
Mhm.
it might take it to another level. So that's something that I would say. But again, all of this is really, everybody has their own comfort level around these kind of issues. And so you have to pay
Mhm.
attention to that.
I
Marlene is saying,
just
oh, go ahead.
Yeah,
Yeah,
go,
sure.
no, I
Ahead.
just wanted to say that I just shared the link to Upend Movement, which is a movement for folks that are organized in to abolish family policing systems and investing in care and healing. And I think that that's a really great, it has been a really great place start for me to start from understanding and reflecting about my role as a social worker and my relationship to mandated reporting and what are the risks that I'm willing to take and what are the spaces within those gray areas that I'm willing to sit in. As Joe was saying, because many times it's sometimes we think we need to do this, but do we really have to? Are there other ways to handle the situation, right? And I think that's the piece of reflection that Joe was sort of asking us to do that I think is really valuable.
Yeah. I think, Marlena, mandated reporting in a lot of ways seems so vague, and I think it causes some anxiety with us social workers. I would probably, any mental health professionals probably, because it's like we're afraid not to report something that is ambiguous, that we are in a constant state of worry about getting in trouble for not
Yeah.
reporting, especially. It just seems like such a gray area, especially with higher risk cases. Yeah. I think the other
Absolutely.
challenge too, I have a little bit more flexibility with myself because I'm in private practice. For those of you in agencies, you might have more limitations, especially if you're reporting to a supervisor and they say, well, no, you need to report that. But I've also come across working with clients, schools reporting what seem to be very, I'll use the word bogus, sort of reports on parents. Um, it just, I think everybody now is this whole liability issue and that sort of thing, and so we just have to be careful of not being so reactive. Again, not to minimize that there are maybe children who are in serious threat or at risk of harm, but we again we have to use our clinical sense. Any other questions?
Yes, Joey.
Jory, I see poverty bias is a reason
Yeah.
for it in schools. Yeah. I
Yeah.
think mandated and also racial bias as well.
Yes.
I think mandated reporting should be similar to veterinarians. With veterinarians, most of the laws for them are not mandated, but it is highly encouraged to report something to the state that is concerning regarding animal abuse, etc. In this way, the anxiety is taken out, but they're more assured and confident because they aren't pressured by getting in trouble. So it's more authentic and thought out in terms of determining risk. So that's a really good point there. And people worry about losing an accreditation license, thereby not being able to help at all. Yes, no, it's a legitimate concern.
And I think if we build relationships of trust with participants, they can share with us and feel safer in sharing with us maybe those situations that may be could potentially put at risk their kids. Like, for example, I was working with a participant who had 2 children. And the father of her children used the, oh my God, what you call that in English? The pension, like the amount that you pay monthly for child support. He
Child
would use
support,
it.
yeah.
He would use a child support as a tool for power and control. So certain months he wouldn't share, like we wouldn't pay child support. And so she had to engage in going out on dates with friends to be able to make up for that amount. And so one of the things that we discussed was, if you have to do this, how can you do this in a safer way in which your children are insulated from it, right? And for example, one of the things she said is the children can go to my friend's house. They won't be here when I am in my dates, right? And I will have my dates in my home because my home feels safer for me in this context, right? And so we figured out a way in which she could still, you know, be able to make up the money that she needed to pay rent, etc. She didn't want to do that for the rest of her life. She clearly wanted, you know, to also find a way to be sure that she could have her own financial independence, and also figure out a way to get the parent, the other parent of the children to be responsible. But you can control that other person, right? The only thing you can control is you. So one of the things that she decided to do, she wanted to go back to school. And so we helped her to be able to go back to school so she could finish her degree, so she would be able to get then employed and then phase out the dates that she was having. Right? Someone else would have said, I have to report this immediately, right? And you know, what would have that done to her and to her kids and to everybody else involved, right? And so we could figure out a way of working with this participant to ensure that she was safe. And in this case, if our concern was also the children, for the children to be safe, and that all worked out. Right. So I think having the space for conversation with people where they feel that they're going to be heard and not judged or punished, it's the first sort of space that we can create, you know, for us to be able to then have these conversations that can lead us to potentially not having to do the Band-Aid reporting stuff that, you know,
Right.
it's uncomfortable to many of us and we know it's harmful.
I would just like to add one other point around this before we, is I think that there is a similar dynamic when we thinking about clients who report to us that they want to die, that maybe they have thoughts about hurting themselves. And
Yeah.
I've had clients come to or sort of report, well, you know, in the past when I've shared this, I've been hospitalized like immediately. And so they are reluctant then to share that they're having thoughts about wanting to die. So we lose that because of that reactivity. People are afraid of being honest.
Yeah.
And so we want to know that if people are thinking about dying and wanting to hurt themselves and not keep it from this, so we can engage in a conversation with them about those issues and not automatically say, oh, okay, then
Yeah.
we need to have you assessed by emergency services.
Absolutely. Or what we say, I mean, I have a kid. How many times I've said to my kid, oh my God, I could kill you right now.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't murdered him and I won't murder him. But I mean, if someone heard that,
Right.
and because of like the poverty bias and all of the other issues that we know are systemic, I heard that immediately, oh, she said she's going to harm her kid. We need to detonate this whole system that eventually can be more hurtful, right, to the person, instead of saying, tell me more about that. Like, what is making you feel that way? And you say, I don't know how to, I'm having a hard time parenting my kid because, you know, X, Y, and Z, and maybe that's the issue, how we support this person to be a better parent, you know, and acknowledge that sometimes, as much as I love my kid and I love him to that, sometimes I just want to be like, oh my God, how did you do that? You know, I think that's it's an important place for us to start from too, like acknowledging our own biases around who's the person saying this thing, and why do we react certain ways when it's said by X and not by Z.